Hello, this is your host, Todd Lewis of the Praise of Folly podcast. Over to like, share, and subscribe. You can follow me on Locals, Telegram, X, and Facebook. You can support me on Subscribestar, buy me a coffee, and you can also check out my Substack. All right, so today's show is entitled Toward a New American Consciousness. This is, again, an idea that I've recently been working on, which is the result of many decades of study. So we'll begin with this. Let's make sure everything works. Yeah, okay. We are ready to go. I have a prepared presentation here. If we look at the current situation, socially, politically, and intellectually in the United States, we see a great change is at work. All of the old ideologies, political slogans, and national bromides are more or less dead. People do not believe in the old narratives and are struggling to find their footing in a world that has been increasingly changing. Many are losing hope at this stage, having been in the fight for so long they don't see where to go forward. The old enemies seem to be defeated, but the world is not improving in the way they thought it would after victory. This is a long, complex problem that I have dealt with in parts elsewhere. This is but a preamble to a new vision that I see over the horizon. To start with, we briefly need to discuss the world that is ending. In the short term, from 2008 to 2025, we had the Democratic ascendancy with Obama and Biden. They pushed the woke or synthetic left, as Caleb Maupin calls them, to undermine anti-war and pro-war labor movements. This was done by seeding already existing movements, such as Occupy Wall Street, with ideas of racial struggle, feminist struggle, and gender identity struggle, in order to dilute the effect of the anti-war, anti-globalist movement. They totally succeeded in this. They also believed that the managerial class could still work and operate at a global scale with all of these people whose entire view of reality is conditioned by simulacra and hyper-reality rather than the lived experiences in real situations. That experiment was a total failure, as we saw in the cut and run evacuation from Afghanistan in 2021 and the current failure in Ukraine as of 2025. A real body blow was dealt to the global American empire by this move, which has provoked a pivot where the elites are now rolling back the woke. We can see this Obama-Biden imperialism as itself an extension of the imperial and commercial ambitions of the U.S. elite back in the late 19th century when they made their debut appearance in the Spanish-American War. This combination of Wall Street banking and industrial trust interests with the revolutionary zeal of techno-utopians and the liberal classes trying to remake man in their image, a total repudiation of the older American values of limited government, self-reliance, non-interventionism abroad, straight dealing, and building up local communities. All the words remained the same, but had taken on whole new meaning that led Americans further and further away from their values. The question of values will be the subject of this talk. If we look at the United States in its infancy during the colonial period, its youth and its early Republican phase, and the crossroads of the U.S. Civil War and the Spanish-American War, we see a nation that defined itself against many of the principles of old Europe, and later, when offered the choice of staying the course or answering the siren call of remaking the world with technology and finance capital, the nation chose to deviate from its roots. Though this deviation was not, nor has been complete, this line of thinking I came to after my roundtable, How Likely is a Mad Max Scenario in the U.S. During Collapse, where I discussed the view of cruel and unusual punishment in the U.S. In the U.S. Constitution, with the 8th Amendment, cruel and unusual punishment is prohibited. Even before the complete independence of the U.S., the early colonies were setting a new course in this regard. The hardliners, the Puritans, didn't burn people at the stakes like they did in old Europe. And Hutchinson and Roger Williams, who both fell afoul of religious authorities, were not killed as heretics but banished. While banishment seems harsh today, it was one of the most humane punishments available at the time. In the 17th century, Roger Williams in Rhode Island and William Penn in Pennsylvania were a good deal more merciful in their punishments. To put this in perspective, English punishments included such measures as castration, disemboweling, drawing and quartering, burning at the stake, and other inhuman methods of execution were normal for traitors or heretics or subject peoples. In addition to the mode of punishment, the punishment often did not fit the crime. In his Utopia, Thomas More states, upon these reasons it is that I think putting thieves to death is not lawful, and it is plain and obvious that it is absurd and of all ill consequence to the Commonwealth that a thief and a murderer should be equally punished. For if a robber sees that his danger is the same as if he is convicted of theft, as if he were guilty of murder, this will naturally incite him to kill the person whom otherwise he would have only robbed. Since if the punishment is the same, there is more security and less danger of discovery when he that can best take it put out of the way, so that terrifying thieves too much provokes them to cruelty. We see in the U.S. colonies a revolution in thought with regards to criminal punishment. Firstly, some forms of punishment are malum in se, that is, wrong in itself, and punishments need to fit the crime. We see in the 17th century something like 12 to 15 capital offenses in Puritan New England. Compare that to over 200 in the mother country. We see a massive change in perspective on what constitutes capital offenses. This is a large disparity in proportionality of punishment in favor of the American spirit. If we use this concept of the biospirit and view the United States as a living organism that grows over time, the stated values and precepts of the colonists in the U.S. Constitution were incomplete at the time of the establishment of the colonies into the early republic. This was in part due to the fact that even with the pioneering notions of justice, for example, the older beliefs of Europe still had purchase on men's minds. Bad habits and ideas do not die overnight. Further forms of punishment that we today deem cruel and unusual, such as lynching and tarring and feathering, gradually declined in frequency over the 19th and 20th centuries. From this, we can see a gradual alignment of stated values of Americans with their actual lived lives and forms of government. A developing consciousness takes time, even centuries, to form. The hard detour of imperialism, which began in the late 19th century, was, in my estimation, an imposition of an alien culture and set of values under the U.S. Republic, which, like a parasite, sought to hijack the host and use it for other purposes. This process did not proceed without opposition, but that opposition until Trump's second term has failed to roll back the empire in any meaningful sense. It looks like Trump and his team are willing to do so, and I think a cautious optimism is warranted in this case. The empire is falling. It's been falling before Trump. If we look at the years 1991 to 2021, this 30-year period was the period of carousing and reveling of the U.S. empire, wasting and spending its forces all over the world, but especially in the Middle East. After 3 decades of dissipation and riot, the empire fled with its tail between its legs in Afghanistan in the year 2021. I predicted then that either Russia and or China would make moves, and at least Russia did in 2022. 2021 to 2024 was a major push by the empire to continue existing by orchestrating a conflict in Ukraine, a conflict that is unwinnable from the U.S. perspective, which thankfully Trump and his team see. Beginning in 2025, we are beginning to see the U.S. drastically cut back its footprint around the world, but especially in Europe. The energy is leaving the system. The empire will fall. The only question is, will the U.S. get ahead of this process by decoupling or going down with the ship fighting pointless foreign wars? It looks like Trump and Musk are doing the former and correct thing. My premise is that if we look at the various cultural movements and subcultures in the U.S., we find ideals that are fragments of the original vision of the American settlers, found in conservative, liberal, libertarian, socialist, environmentalist, and religious groups. In short, a fragmented consciousness. These fragments of concepts were locked into place by the culture war and cultural parochialism, with the erasure of technologies, liquid modernity, culture war burnout, the march of time invalidating certain beliefs, and general fragmentation of political life. And these ideals are now becoming free-floating concepts that can be recombined in fresh and new ways. I believe that we might be seeing a new American consciousness forming, a unity movement, if you will, that will represent the combination of these values into a new expression of old values expressed in terms suitable for our own age and in the challenges therein. Why do I think this? For starters, while initially mocked by many on the dissident right, the normicon effort to argue that slavery is not only something that affects all black people, but all people, including whites, see the enslavement of whites by Arab and Turkish Islamic pirates, but that the British and U.S. ended slavery seems to be gaining widespread traction in the online space. I see more and more black YouTubers discussing white slavery. While they are likely normicon in their values, this still represents a shift from the totalitarian humanist indoctrination they were receiving from the progressive left. The triumphs of the U.S. labor movement in the 19th and 20th centuries with regards to better pay, safer working conditions, and shorter hours, which at the time was a far-left socialist position, is now more or less accepted by most Americans as common sense and humane. Right? Even the most diehard libertarians in the heyday of the Ron Paul era never said, we're going to bring back, nobody today is recommending a return of the death special, for example. or prison camps for workers, like we saw in West Virginia and Colorado. Libertarians and socialists have built up a comprehensive critique of the U.S. empire from two distinct perspectives that I won't pretend can be stitched together into one correlation, but that the best of both can be extracted and synthesized into a new comprehensive anti-imperialist critique. What might a new American consciousness look like? I think we need to think in metapolitical terms. I'm not saying that all Americans will be homogeneous in their values, at least not yet, but that Americans are converging on a set of best practices and national characteristics that will embody the best that this nation has had to offer. Think of it as a reification of the abstract principles of the founding generation. A major example of this is the use of free labor and hostility to top-down coercion. While the issues of race will not be solved overnight, nobody is seriously arguing for genocide, ethnic cleansing, or the return of slavery as an economic system. I think a kind of generalized libertarian principle of freedom of association will set in. I'm thinking of the vision for South Africa that was advocated by Francis Kendall and Leon Liu, and their after apartheid, the solution for South Africa. In this, they envision, based on the principle of freedom of association, a range of differing self-governing communities based on the Swiss cantonal model that might be blacks only or whites only or some mixed population. Nobody will be forced to live with people he finds disagreeable. This, I think, is the underlying principle on which all other American principles are founded on. The rejection of the use of force, or maybe excessive use of force, to compel people into this or that mold. Freedom of association, speech, and religion are all principles that assume the rejection of force. This can be shown by the philosophical exercise that one must ask, for X to be true or even conceivable, what else must be the case? That is what you must already believe first. And in this case, I think for those, you already have to believe that the use of force should be limited to the most, the extreme cases, like, for example, police against criminals or something. In this case, I predict that through a combination of burnout and free association, the race question will fall into the background as people seek to choose who they live with. The federal government in this context will be more of an administrator of self-governing communities. It's hard to escape this idea if you look at like Musk and sort of his ideals. I mean, obviously he's not in government, but he's very influential with Trump. And I'm sure his ideals will propagate throughout any future Republican conservative government, because it's going to be coming out of this Trump-Musk matrix. The American conception of can-do, self-reliance, and do-it-yourself activities will lead to a scientific approach to life. I see a future in which existentialism is seen as a practical science by which individuals, through trial and error, find out what works and what does not work in their lives in order to achieve goals. As we enter the long emergency, waiting for Washington or state capitals or some distant corporation or NGO to do something will no longer work. People will have to be proactive and hands-on. This will provide a selection pressure for self-reliance. Let's focus on a few core ideas that I think will be the foundations for this new American consciousness, or maybe a better way to put it is a realignment towards the original principles. Freedom of association, freedom of religion, freedom of speech, a willingness to not let individuals be defined by their past, self-reliance, problem-solving, and something I have spoken about elsewhere, the rise of a spiritual science. The United States and its metapolitical origins is found in both the scientific rationalism of the Enlightenment and science and the moral foundations of Christianity, with heavy supplementation by the broader European tradition integrated with the pagan classics. This forms a unique base from which to develop a new civilization. The top-down centralized control of the state and the church in all Europe was repudiated by the U.S. on the grounds of freedom from coercive control and freedom of thought. If we look at the old world, intellectual trends rooted in Greco-Roman thought and biblical religion, we see that the already existing structures of old Europe impinged on their expression in the fullest possible form. While Christianity in the 4th century stimulated the first hospitals with Basil the Cappadocian, and the university system in the 11th century in the Latin West, already existing traditions and institutions impinged on their fullest expression. In North America, not counting Mexico, no large urban civilizations existed to exert inertia on the nascent republic. This amounted to a civilizational blank slate. We saw that the settlers in the early republic were able to build a new civilization utilizing these principles against severe odds. A retrenchment of the top-down imperialistic forces began in 1898 with the rise of U.S. overseas possessions, and especially in the 20th century after 1945, where the U.S. positioned itself as the world's policeman. This produced a downward pressure on the principles embodied by the early republic. I argue that as the empire falls and is bankrupted, where will Americans turn for a new vision on how to live? The most natural choice is where we left off in 1898. Well, I have spoken of this before. I think that Isaac Asimov in his Foundation series hints provocatively at a future mental science, or what I would call a spiritual science. Such a science was, I believe, already being developed in the late 19th and early 20th century, where you have popularizers such as Algernon Blackwood with John Silence, Arthur Machen with Dyson, and William Hope Hodgson with Kornacki, were spiritual or occult scientists. They gave the air of being popularizers of an already existing system of thought. In many ways, the materialism of the 20th century and the trauma of World War I ended this line of investigation. For example, Hodgson himself dies in the trenches. All right. If you look at the concept of Yankee ingenuity as a colloquialism, which refers to the problem-solving abilities of not just Americans from the Northeast, but eventually all the country, this ingenuity, along with self-reliance and a scientific approach to both the material and spiritual worlds, would be the core of this new consciousness. The second foundation from Asimov is the best representation I could find to point for an example. Though in reality, such a new consciousness would likely be a synthesis of both the first and second foundations, the inner circle of the Philosopher's Stone, and other historical elements. This new American man, if you will be highly adaptive and intellectual. He will have a rich education in the liberal arts, as was their fashion in early America, and the best elements of practical philosophy in terms of material sciences and ethics. I tend to view existentialism as a kind of social science that equips the individual to figure out how to get out of the deep end he was thrown into in life. I see the Christian existentialists such as Kierkegaard and Dostoevsky as a focusing lens, relying on key Christian truths to focus and contextualize the other themes and observations of existentialists like Nietzsche, Sartre, and Baudrillard, and existentialist adjacent thinkers like Marx. Processes that are organic, natural, and bottom-up will be preferred means of organizing rather than those that are synthetic, plastic, and top-down. Patience will reassert itself as a virtue. Modern Americans live in a blur of instant everything. They expect instant results all the time. This is, of course, impractical. The older insight of the Roman general Sertorius will be watchword again. Ye see, many of my allies, that perseverance is more efficacious than violence, and that many things which cannot be mastered when they stand together yield when one masters them little by little. For irresistible is the force of continuity, by virtue of which advancing time subdues and captures every power. And time is a kindly ally for all who act as diligent attendants upon opportunity, but a most bitter enemy for all who urge matters on unseasonably. A better understanding of the time dimension and how actions take place within time and affect outcomes will be better understood. If we define philosophy in practical terms as a praxis, then it is simply this: the description of two or more objects in symbolic form and the relations between them. By this, I mean a practical philosophy would be one that understands the nature of the objects being considered, and then they would be related together symbolically. This could be seen as a sort of simulated role play, like when men training for being a military officer wargame various scenarios. This wargaming will help people develop a clear view towards charting a path to achieving their goals. This will be more controversial, but if we conceptualize the concept of the law of diminishing returns and the careful examination of early socialist literature from 1870 to 1917, we can make a case that while the U.S. has been seen historically as a bastion of capitalism and free markets, I foresee that this future consciousness will look a lot less capitalist and, for lack of a better word, more socialistic. My basic theory is this: in the 19th century, labor movements in the U.S. and Europe, but for our purposes, we will stick to the U.S., were developing along socialist and even Marxian lines that were a serious threat to the bourgeoisie. In the U.S., while some direct application of force was used early on, eventually a superior form of control was discovered: the use of countergangs. I argue that the culture war is a frozen conflict led by countergangs. These countergangs of synthetic leftists can possibly be seen as early as 1917 with Trotsky and his Western backers in New York. I hold to this thesis that socialism, in fact, should be seen as a right-wing reaction to capital. I have a video on this topic entitled "Socialism as a Right-Wing Reaction to Capitalism." A major reason why the pro-labor movement in the U.S. failed is that the suite of ideas which emerged in theory and praxis to resist the forces of capital were never fully integrated into a cultural life. They were a sort of synthetic externally derived set of values. I postulated that these values will be rediscovered and integrated into a living culture, not just some pronouncements from the intelligentsia. Think of a culture of unionizing and monkey wrenching. The reason being is you're never going to get more money or better your life economically by just, cap in hand begging, the men with money to give it to you. They won't. Right? Machiavelli wrote The Prince in order to ingratiate himself to one of the bourgeois. Didn't work. They don't need you. Right? That's the point. You can't go begging cap in hand. They always break their promises. So you're going to have to look out for yourself. And reintegrating these concepts are how you're going to do that. Technology, no surprise here, will be seen as a dangerous and unnatural force that enervates the user, like Morgoth bleeding his essence into Arda for control. The dictum of Gandalf, he that breaks a thing to find out what it is, has left the path of wisdom, will be a foundation for a new science. The same mindset is expressed by Derek Jensen in his appearance in the Occupied Cascadia documentary. He speaks of the predictive power of science as the ability to apply force. He engages in a thought experiment that if I put a gun to your head and tell you to jump through a hoop, and furthermore predict I can make you jump through the hoop, and furthermore you do jump through that hoop, I have indeed made a scientific prediction, but I have destroyed our ability to have a friendship. This kind of thinking will be replaced by a scientific view of things based more on observation and careful reflection, think the reasoning mind of Sherlock Holmes, rather than the crude quarters of a 19th century army surgeon who can only lop off damaged limbs. To summarize all this up, the United States stands at a crossroads as the old simulated identities produced by the empire and the empire itself falls to pieces. The most natural course would be to return to the original American vision of the best of the Western tradition, liberated from the straitjacket of top-down imperial structures, such as the state, and the legacy of Christendom and the state church. Of course, some black swan event might produce a new ideological energy, but we cannot really plan for that, otherwise it wouldn't be a black swan event. I think the detour from, say, 1898 to 2025 of the U.S. empire is being abandoned, and this leaves room for a restoration of the original values. Even in the early stages of its development, the United States did not fully embody the ideas it stood for. But over time, with the example of capital punishment, we see a shift towards actions aligning with ideals. With collapse of subcultures, I see the ideas that represent fragments of this consciousness that were locked away in various political ideologies become free and free-floating. This means that they can be recombined in a more consistent expression of this nascent consciousness. Two core principles will be the foundation of this consciousness: rejection of the use of force and compulsion as the normative modes of organizing human society, and practical scientific approach, developing social science rooted in Christian existentialism, creating a foundation for ideals of freedom of association, speech, and belief, anti-war and pro-labor attitudes, and more speculative still, a new spiritual science. All right. So we have a super chat from Middleton Walker. Thank you for $9.99. Stick this feather in your scholastic cap. Well, thank you, Middleton Walker. We have Tricky Woo cares that. Oh, yeah, cool. We got Ardent Party and GF. Hello, guys. So there's a lot here. I can sort of unpack a little bit more because I'm tying together a lot of separate videos that I've done that maybe not everybody's seen. I argue, for example, as we enter a low energy state, one of the things that the libertarians did get right when they talked about arbitration is that arbitration is cheaper. They were thinking in terms of money, but money's one way to measure energy, than a direct fight. Where I think they were wrong when they were talking about private defense agencies is that the institutions they envisioned would have had a lot of energy to use, and corporations would have had, as I had mentioned in my debate with Bob Murphy on the Tom Woods show, they have every incentive to launch preemptive strikes because they don't want to have their property damaged by just waiting to take the punch like Rocky. But nonetheless, it's true. And so as we go into a lower energy state, those solutions that rely on the raw application of force will become harder and harder to do, and therefore less and less effective. We can also tie this into the broader theme of Rene Girard that, Western consciousness develops, right? So the principle of like sacrifice, animal or human sacrifice, whatever you believe about Jesus Christ, his life and death gave Europe this new perspective, this new consciousness of sacrifice, so that it's more or less inconceivable to envision on a large scale a return to animal or human sacrifice. We can see also maybe chattel slavery beginning in the 19th century. That seems very difficult to go back to. We're also seeing that other parts of the world, I mentioned for example in other videos, Latin America, for example. In the 19th century, especially in Mexico, it was blood drenched, and then the Mexican Revolution was also blood drenched. And you compare that to even the American Civil War, and you have mass execution of civilians in Latin America. Whole regions put to the sword. Something you'd never see in the United States. Didn't happen in the American Revolution. Didn't happen in the War of 1812. Didn't happen in the Civil War. And so, what I would say then is that it seems like Latin Americans are like getting tired of that too. I mean, obviously there's cartel violence in Mexico and Guatemala. We still have the FARC in Colombia. But I think it's going to be more and more difficult for them to resort to the kind of crude and destructive pacification techniques we saw with like Iriarte in Mexico, or even Santa Ana in Mexico. So in that regard, I think we can even see in those countries that were attempting to mirror and copy the United States. Again, this pull towards there's got to be a better way to do this. We can't have caudillos running around just beheading people, or revolutionaries lining up against the wall like in Cuba, executing people, right? So I think we're beginning to see a shift there too, in consciousness, where people are we're just done with this, right? And in the video I did last year, I speculated that if we also combine people's opposition to the global empire, which I think in the United States is growing, and we see more and more of the truth revealed through investigation, we could see a reaction against militarism like this as well, where we're just not. That's where I had a controversial video. I think I called it "The End of War?" ? And I'm like, well, if we think of the forever war, well, that will end because that depends on industrial capitalism. A large-scale industrial war will also probably end because of the end of industrial civilization. Other conflicts, which you might call war, may or may not continue, but depending on a whole variety of factors. So there's that. And I think also, too, that in general, because the personal has been made political by the woke left and the culture war has, and in some cases is still at fever pitch, people are just tired. They're just tired of it. They don't want to do this anymore. The reason why they might still do it is they don't know what to do instead, which that's an unpleasant place to be. But I think it creates the potential for something else. Seema so blame, what's your timeline on collapse? I mean, the problem is that's going to be hard to calculate, because ultimately what you'd have to know is all the current energy inputs right now into the system. And that's really hard to know because technology, capitalism, and the modern political state seek to hide social relations. So it's going to be it's going to be quite the detective job to figure out all the energy inputs into the system. And then furthermore, you'd have to then figure out somehow what would be, well, I don't think any quote unquote groundbreaking energy source will be developed, like say the shift from wood to coal or coal to oil. But I do think though that there will be like stopgap inventions, like for example, fracking is a stopgap, and that's going to be hard to predict too. But what we do know is population collapse, which is just written in stone at this point. The numbers are in. We're just waiting for the people to die. And then when they do, it'll be like a car wreck where just everything just changes overnight. We have sometime probably by the middle of the century, we're going to really feel the population collapse. Now, whether that will lead to because in the middle of the century is under 25 years. Boomers will probably be all gone by then. Many Gen X will probably be gone by then. And so we'll have a really sparsely populated world, which automation will be one way to offset this, which is what they're leaning into right now. But I think that overall, the real question is this: how many people do you need in a population group to maintain an advanced technological society? If your population drops 50%, 60%, 90%, are you going to have enough people to even maintain the system? That, I think, is going to be the actual breaking point. And the population collapse will really be felt probably sometime, unless we have some black swan event, like a plague or a war, which or mass suicide or something, which culls people much sooner. That's what I'm thinking would be the possible tipping point. But again, we don't know. We've never been here before. We don't know how many people it takes to keep a technological civilization going, especially when it's being automated. So again, it can't. I don't think it can go on forever, but that would be the first big thing to look for. Wandering Panda. Any thoughts on highlining and localism restoring a strong cultural moral order? Yeah, ultimately everything is going to have to become more local, because as international supply lines, as the U.S. empire contracts and is defunded, think of the shipping, the Navy assets, which protect international trade, will not be there. And so most countries will necessarily have to resort to some sort of autarky, because international trade will just become too expensive. In that regard, North America is actually fairly well positioned to deal with that. But and then that localism then would have to develop as a response. The biggest impediment to that is people don't trust each other, and people won't do anything, quote unquote, for free. There has to be they're always working an angle. They have to get something out of it. But that's just not community thinking. You can't have a community if everybody in that community is working an angle trying to get the most for themselves, as we've seen time and again in the United States. So, all right, everyone, that's all I have for tonight, and this will be my last show for the week. Make sure to tune in next week for a whole new set of episodes. This is Todd Lewis of the Praise of Fly podcast, signing off.